June 19, 1944, before dawn, the Philippine Sea. The bridge of the Imperial Japanese Navy's newest carrier, Tahoe, is a cavern of shadow and muted red light. The air is still, thick with the scent of salt, oil, and tension. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands motionless, his gaze fixed on the black expanse beyond the armored glass. Below him, in the immense darkness, the silhouettes of his mobile. Fleet 9 aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers cut through the swell. It is the most powerful armada Japan has assembled since Midway. Ozawa's plan is elegant, daring. It hinges on distance and faith his aircraft possess. Longer range than the Americans, he will launch from beyond their reach, strike their fleet, then recover on friendly airfields at Guam and Rota, a shuttle of steel and fire. Modern tactical maneuver, but an older, deeper belief hangs over this fleet like a shroud. Among the crew, whispers pass. The Americans have penetrated the absolute national defense sphere. They threaten the homeland itself. In such an hour, history calls for a miracle, a divine wind, a kamikaze. Ozawa does not speak of gods. He speaks of search planes, of vectoring attacks, of pressing the advantage, but his entire strategy is a wager on the intangible, on the superior fighting spirit of his aircrews, on the favor of fortune, on the desperate hope that against overwhelming American industry, something miraculous can still tip the scales. The first faint smear of gray bleeds into the eastern horizon. Pilots shuffle towards their aircraft on the flight deck. Soon, the engines will turn the sea to thunder. The admiral watches the dawn. He is waiting for the wind. A wind that the radar screens of the waiting U.S. Fifth Fleet have already begun to measure with cold, electronic precision. To understand the weight of that dawn in June 1944, one must journey back 7 centuries to another existential threat born across the sea, in 1274 and again in 1281. The Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan launched massive invasion fleets against the Japanese archipelago. The samurai defenders fought with ferocious bravery, but were pushed to the brink. Then, as the legends recount, the heavens intervened, cataclysmic typhoons. Kamikaze, the divine winds, shattered the Mongol fleets, drowning tens of thousands of invaders and saving Japan from conquest. This event was woven into the very fabric of national identity. Japan was a Shinkoku, a divine land protected by the gods. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Japan modernized at a breathtaking pace, this myth was not discarded, it was weaponized. The Meiji Restoration and the rise of militaristic state Shinto fused ancient belief with modern nationalism. The emperor was declared a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The state, the military, and the divine became inseparable. Soldiers and sailors were taught that their spirit, their Yamato Damasha, could overcome material disadvantage, death in battle. For the emperor was the highest honor, a sacred return to the nation's spiritual essence. This ideology propelled Japan's stunning victories in the Russo-Japanese War and the early campaigns of the Second World War. Pearl Harbor itself was seen not merely as a tactical masterstroke, but as a manifestation of that fierce national will, the audacity, the precision, the sheer luck of that attack. To many, it felt like divine favor, but the crucible of total war tests all faiths. The tide turned at Midway in June 1942, where in 5 minutes U.S. dive bombers sent 4 of Japan's finest carriers to the bottom. It was a catastrophic material loss, yet the institutional and cultural belief in a climactic war winning battle, a kantai-kessen, and in the power of spirit to redeem any situation, only hardened. The myth of the kamikaze evolved from a historical weather event into a metaphor for any miraculous, nation-saving intervention. By 1944, the material reality was grim. The American industrial juggernaut was producing ships and aircraft at a rate Japan could not comprehend, let alone match. U.S. submarines were strangling the home island's supply lines. Island fortresses like Tarawa and Kwajalein, believed to be impregnable, had fallen to a new form of warfare. coordinated, overwhelming power of American amphibious assault groups centered on the fast aircraft carrier. Japan's strategic depth was collapsing, the inner defense ring was breached. The next American move would be decisive, and when U.S. forces landed on the islands of Saipan and Tinian in the Mariana Islands on June 15, 1944, they placed a dagger at the throat of Japan's empire. The Marianas were part of the absolute national defense sphere. Their loss would put American long-range bombers within striking distance of Tokyo itself. For Imperial Japan, this was the modern equivalent of the Mongol hordes at the shoreline. The hour demanded not just a military response, but a spiritual one. The entire remaining strength of the carrier fleet, under Admiral Ozawa, was sortied. Its mission to engage the U.S. Fifth Fleet, destroy its carriers, and annihilate the invasion force on the beaches. The stage was set for the largest carrier battle in history. It was to be Japan's Kamikaze, their final, desperate bid to summon a modern divine wind. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the American force sailing toward this confrontation represented a philosophy forged in a different crucible. The United States did not believe in divine winds. It believed in Detroit, in Newport News, in the drafting tables of Grumman and the laboratories of MIT. Its faith was placed in production lines, metallurgy, logistics, and the systematic application of scientific solutions to problems of warfare. The shock of Pearl Harbor had not broken this spirit. It had redirected it with furious focus. The dormant industrial giant was now not only awake but sprinting. The instrument of American vengeance and strategy was the Fast Carrier Task Force. By 1944, it was no longer just a collection of ships. It was a single, integrated weapon system of unprecedented mobility and power. At its heart were the new Essex-class fleet carriers, floating cities of steel that could carry over 90 aircraft, sustain high speeds, and absorb tremendous punishment. They were surrounded by a protective screen of fast battleships, cruisers, and most importantly, destroyers, some equipped with powerful new air search radars, acting as the fleet's electronic eyes far over the horizon. But the true revolution was in the air and in the mind. In the cockpit, the fragile, early war Wildcats had been replaced by the F-6F Hellcat, designed with one brutal purpose: to kill the Japanese Zero. It was heavier, faster in a dive, more rugged, and packed a devastating armament of 6.50 caliber machine guns. Its pilot was protected by armor plate and a bulletproof windshield. It was a weapon of industrial supremacy, designed to negate the finesse of its opponent with overwhelming force. The most profound change, however, was invisible. It resided in darkened rooms deep within the carriers, rooms lined with radar scopes and humming with radio traffic. The Combat Information Center, or CIC, this was the brain of the new American way of war. Radar data, radio reports, and sightings were funneled here, plotted on large maps by a team of specialists. From this nexus, a new breed of officer, the fighter director, could see the entire aerial battlefield in real time. He could vector defending Hellcat squadrons like chess pieces to intercept incoming Japanese raids long before they saw the fleet. This system, called tactical air control, turned the chaotic melee of dogfighting into a managed, efficient process of destruction. It prioritized defense, control, and the conservation of force over individual heroics. Commanding this formidable instrument was Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man of meticulous calculation and profound restraint, unlike his more flamboyant contemporary Admiral William Bull Halsey. Spruance was a chess player. His primary mission, as ordered by his superior Admiral Chester Nimitz, was unambiguous: protect the amphibious invasion force at Saipan at all costs. The destruction of the Japanese fleet was a secondary objective. This defensive mandate would govern every decision he made. Spruance did not seek a dramatic, swirling duel of carriers. He sought a decisive, one-sided engagement on his own terms. He would be the anvil, letting the Japanese fleet break itself upon the interlocking layers of his defense. Thus, as Ozawa's fleet sailed from its bases, it was steering not merely toward an enemy fleet but toward an entirely new paradigm of combat. One side carried the weight of 7 centuries of national mythology, a faith that spirit could bend reality. The other side carried the weight of 10,000 factories, a cold faith in systems, machinery, and the mathematical certainty of industrial output. Their convergence in the Philippine Sea was more than a battle, it was a collision of epochs. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was an anomaly in the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a career destroyer and cruiser man. He was a tactical realist, known for his sharp intellect and, by 1944, a profound understanding of his fleet's dire limitations. He knew the numbers. His 9 carriers, though a formidable force on paper, carried only about 430 aircraft, many flown by pilots with drastically reduced training compared to the veterans lost earlier in the war. Opposite him, Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 boasted 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft, all flown by increasingly seasoned aircrews. Ozawa's plan, Operation Ago, was born from this stark realism. It was a brilliant attempt to leverage his few remaining advantages. His carriers, notably the new Tahoe, had unarmored flight decks, allowing them to carry more aircraft. More critically, his main strike aircraft, the Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber and the Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bomber, had a combat radius significantly longer than their American counterparts. He also possessed a handful of obsolete Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, stripped of armament to act as long-range radar-equipped search planes. This gave birth to his shuttle concept. Ozawa would position his fleet 300 to 400 miles west of the American task force, safely outside the presumed range of U.S. counterstrikes. From there, he would launch massive, coordinated raids. After attacking the U.S. fleet, his planes would not return to their vulnerable carriers. Instead, they would continue eastward to land, refuel, and rearm at the Japanese airfields on Guam and Rota. They would then launch a second strike against the Americans on their return flight to the carriers. It was a plan of exquisite economy of force, maximizing the reach of each airframe. To Ozawa, it was a pragmatic solution, but to the men under his command and to the high command in Tokyo, it was infused with a deeper symbolism. It was a long-range, sustained blow, a relentless tempest launched from a sanctuary. It was in essence a tactical blueprint for a man-made divine wind. His confidence rested not on superstition, but on the belief that Japanese aerial skill and Yamato Damashii, operating within this clever plan, could achieve the impossible one more time. While Ozawa placed his faith in a plan, the American defense resided in a room, deep in the carrier USS Lexington. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was a peculiar mix of academic calm and controlled frenzy. The air was cool from the blowers, smelling of ozone from the radar sets and stale coffee. Young officers, many fresh from college, hunched over scopes, their faces illuminated by the faint green glow of the PPI plan position indicator. On it, the carrier task force was a tiny, clustered dot at the center. Every few seconds, the sweeping arm of the radar painted the sea and sky for hundreds of miles. Any return, any blip, was a potential threat. These blips were tracked, their speed and course calculated by plotters moving symbols across a large plexiglass map. The senior fighter director officer, headphones clamped to his ears, watched this evolving picture. His voice, calm and precise, would soon go out over a dedicated radio frequency to the orbiting combat air patrols of F-6F Hellcats. Bandits, bears 280 degrees, distance 150 miles, Angels 20, vector 285, Buster. In that moment, the individual courage of the pilot was subsumed into a system. He was not chasing a glimpse of an enemy in the vast sky. He was being guided with mathematical certainty to an interception point. The American advantage was no longer just a better plane, it was knowledge. Meanwhile, high above the fleet, the Hellcat pilot in his cockpit experienced a different Kind of war, his aircraft felt solid, powerful. The roar of the 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney engine was a constant, reassuring thunder. He checked his 6.50 caliber machine guns. He trusted the armor plate behind his seat. He was not a samurai, he was a technician in a powered, armored suit. When the fighter director's voice crackled in his headphones, giving him a vector, he turned without question. He was the tip of a spear thrown by a machine 100 miles away. His job was not to display transcendent spirit, but to execute a function: close, aim, fire, and kill. The impending battle would test not his soul's purity, but his training, his eyesight, and the reliability of his equipment. The system had removed the chaos. What remained was a grim, efficient process. The fundamental clash in the skies over the Philippine Sea was between two aircraft that represented the diametrically opposed design philosophies of their nations. The Japanese A-6M Type 0 fighter, the legendary Zero, was a relic of a different war. Conceived in the late 1930s, it was a masterpiece of minimalism to achieve phenomenal range and dogfighting agility. Every ounce of weight was stripped away. It had no armor plating for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its lightweight airframe, constructed from a special aluminum alloy, gave it a climb rate and turning circle that pilots in 1941 found supernatural. It was a rapier, fast, nimble, and lethal in the hands of an expert. But by June 1944, the rapier was meeting a warhammer. The American F-6F Hellcat was designed with the lessons of the Zero's early dominance in mind. It was heavy, brutish, and simple. Its airframe was built to withstand incredible punishment. It featured 212 pounds of armor plate around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb multiple hits. Its radial engine produced over 25% more power than the Zero's. While it could not outturn a Zero in a classic dogfight, it didn't need to. Its doctrine was boom and zoom, use superior dive speed, and climb rate to make high-speed slashing attacks. Then disengage. In a head-on pass or a diving attack, its 6.50 caliber machine guns, firing 800 rounds per minute each, would tear the fragile Zero to pieces. This technological disparity was magnified by the human factor, the veteran Japanese pilots who could exploit the Zero's delicate strengths were largely gone, lost in the grinding attrition of the Solomons and the Central Pacific. Their replacements, though brave, had flight training measured in months, not years. They lacked the hundreds of hours of experience needed to master the Zero's demanding flight characteristics and to execute the complex, fluid tactics of their predecessors. Conversely, the American pilot flying the Hellcat was often better trained, with a robust stateside program emphasizing gunnery and formation flying. He flew an aircraft that was forgiving, stable, and built to keep him alive. The battle would not be a duel between master swordsmen. It would be a series of executions where the strengths of one aircraft rendered the strengths of the other obsolete. Perhaps the single greatest advantage wielded by the U.S. Fifth Fleet was one that rendered the core of Japanese naval doctrine, the surprise, massed attack, null and void. By 1944, American radar technology had evolved from a crude early warning device into the central nervous system of the fleet. The CXAM-1 and later SK air search radars could detect large formations of aircraft at ranges over 100 nautical miles. More critically, the new SG surface search radar could pick out ships and landmasses even in pitch darkness or poor weather. This network of electronic eyes was integrated through the CIC on every carrier and major vessel. For the Japanese, this created a shadow war they were losing before the first shot was fired. Their own radar technology was primitive, unreliable, and rarely integrated into a cohesive command system. Japanese search planes still relied primarily on the human eye. This meant that while Ozawa's search planes had to physically find Spruance S. Fleet, a needle in a million-square-mile haystack, the American radar picket destroyers, stationed in a ring 50 miles out from the main fleet, would detect Ozawa's incoming raids the moment they crested the horizon. the element of surprise, the sacred tenet of Japanese naval strategy since Tsushima Strait, had been stripped away by invisible microwaves. Furthermore, American radio intelligence and code breaking, the ongoing magic program, provided strategic warning, while they did not have Ozawa's precise location. At every moment, they knew his fleet had sortied, they knew its approximate strength, and they knew its likely intent to attack the Saipan beachhead. Thus, Spruance could position his fleet with defensive certainty. He consolidated Task Force 58 to the west of Saipan, a massive floating bulwark. His carriers steamed into the wind to launch and recover fighters, but their primary stance was not offensive, it was one of alert readiness. They were a spider at the center of a vast electronic web, waiting, knowing that any approaching fly would trigger the entire system into a lethal, coordinated response. The Japanese were planning a masterful, long-range thrust. The Americans had made the entire ocean around them a transparent and deadly trap. A critical pillar of Ozawa's plan, and a key element of the hoped-for modern kamikaze, was not at sea at all. It was on the islands of Guam and Rota, these Japanese airfields, heavily fortified and stocked with fuel and ammunition, were meant to be the unsinkable aircraft carriers in Ozawa's shuttle system. They were the secure bases from which the second wave of strikes would originate, doubling the pressure on the American fleet, the land-based air forces of the Imperial Japanese Navy, under Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, were supposed to be a formidable partner, numbering over 500 aircraft. Their role was to weaken the American carriers with preliminary attacks and then support Ozawa's flyers upon their arrival. This aspect of the plan represented a fatal miscalculation, a disconnect between command optimism and battlefield reality. In the weeks leading up to the fleet engagement, the Americans had not been idle. Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58 had launched a relentless preemptive campaign against these very airfields, a series of devastating fighter sweeps and bombing raids, beginning in February and intensifying in the days before the invasion, had systematically pulverized Kakuta's air power. Hangars were destroyed, runways cratered, aircraft shattered on the ground. What remained of Japanese air strength in the Marianas was a shattered remnant, incapable of mounting the coordinated mass attacks the plan required. This failure had a cascading effect. First, it meant Ozawa's arriving strike aircraft would not find a safe, operational haven. They would be attempting to land on damaged fields, likely under American air attack, with limited fuel and often battle damage. Second, it meant there would be no supportive second wave from the islands to hit the American fleet. The shuttle system was broken before the first shuttle flight began. Most critically, it stripped away the element of a pincer movement. The American fleet would not be caught between Ozawa's carrier planes and Kakuta's land-based planes. It could focus its entire defensive might in one direction, west, toward the approaching Japanese fleet. The divine wind was meant to blow from multiple quarters. Instead, one of its vital sources had been stilled by the methodical, grinding violence of American air supremacy. Before the main battle even started, beneath the strategies, technologies, and tactics lay a profound psychological schism that would dictate how each side fought. For the American sailor, marine, and pilot in the summer of 1944, there was a growing sense of inevitable victory. It was not arrogance, but a quiet confidence born from tangible evidence. They had seen their own industrial might in the endless streams of new ships joining the fleet. They felt the reliability of their equipment. They had experienced the effectiveness of their coordinated tactics at Tarawa, Kwajalein, and in the Marshall Islands. While fear and fatigue were constant companions, there was an underlying belief in the system. They were part of a machine that was larger than any individual, a machine that was demonstrably winning. This granted a certain grim stability. They expected to face a fierce enemy, but they also expected their tools and their teamwork to see them through. For the Japanese, the psychology was inverted. They were burdened by a deepening Sense of catastrophic inevitability that the war itself was lost, yet propelled by it. Desperate, almost transcendent, hope for a single, saving miracle. Every senior officer, from Ozawa down, understood the material odds were impossible, but within that hopelessness lay a twisted freedom, the freedom to risk everything on one throw of the dice. The concept of Jyokusai, shattering like a jewel, was becoming operational. Policy, it was better to perish in a glorious, all-or-nothing bid for a decisive victory than to slowly wither under America's material pressure. This created a force that was simultaneously fatalistic and fanatical. The pilots flying toward the American fleet knew their training was inferior, their machines outclassed. Many did not expect to return, yet they flew on, believing that if their collective will was pure enough, if their sacrifice was total enough, they could somehow force a supernatural reversal of fortune. They were not just executing a military operation, they were participating in a national ritual of salvation. One side fought with the confidence of proven systems, the other fought with the fervor of a last, desperate prayer. This psychological landscape set the stage for a confrontation that would be less a battle of tactical maneuver and more a brutal, one-sided test of an ancient faith against an industrial age certainty. We now move from the setup of forces and mindsets to the moment of collision. Dawn to midday, June 19, 1944, Turkey shoot. The first light of June 19 revealed a placid Philippine sea, but the ether was alive with signals. At 5:30, one of Ozawa's scout planes, a Judy, radioed a contact report. The American task force. The report was flawed, overestimating the distance, but it was enough. Confident in his longer reach and his shuttle plan, Ozawa began launching his first major strike at 8:30. 69 aircraft, a mix of Zeros, Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers, roared off the decks of his carriers and turned east. The modern Kamikaze was in the air. Almost immediately, the American system engaged. The raid was detected by the radar. Picket destroyer USS St at a range of 150 miles. The blips swarmed onto the PPI scopes in the CICs of every American carrier, the calm, procedural voices of fighter directors went to work. Aboard the USS Lexington, in Combat 1, the order went out. All F-6FS, Vector 285, Angels 20 Buster, the Combat Air Patrol, already orbiting, banked westward and poured on power. Additional Hellcats were scrambled from the decks of the 15 carriers, creating a layered, rising wall of interceptors. The first American pilots to sight the Japanese formation were stunned. It was not a tight, disciplined strike group, but a loose, straggling gaggle, the inexperienced Japanese pilots, struggling with navigation and formation keeping over the vast ocean, were easy prey. At 10:15, the Hellcats struck. The radio nets exploded with terse, frantic calls. Tally-ho, bandits at 12 o'clock, hi. Come on down, boys, we got customers. Then a voice crackling with disbelief and lethal efficiency. Hell, this is like an old time Turkey shoot. The metaphor was instantly, brutally accurate. The Hellcats dove from superior altitude, their .50 calibers stitching long lines of fire through the thin-skinned Japanese aircraft. Zeros trying to turn and fight found themselves outdived and outgunned. Jills and Judys, laden with bombs and torpedoes, fell like stones, their wings sheared off or their fuel tanks erupting in orange fireballs. Parachutes were rare. The sea below became littered with flaming wreckage and spreading oil slicks. Of the 69 aircraft in that first raid, only 24 would survive to even glimpse the American fleet, and those faced a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire so dense that American crewmen said the sky turned black with flak bursts. Not a single bomb or torpedo hit an American ship. Ozawa, unaware of the scale of the disaster, launched a second, larger raid of 128 aircraft at 900 and a third of 47 aircraft at 1,000. The result was a horrific repetition. Each wave was detected at extreme range, met by a waiting swarm of vectored Hellcats. and systematically dismantled, the American fighter directors, their voices growing. Hoarse but never losing their clinical tone, orchestrated the slaughter. Pilots returned to their carriers, their gun cameras filled with footage of disintegrating enemy planes, to rearm, refuel, and be launched back into the fray. The system was a self-sustaining cycle of destruction. While his air groups were being annihilated in the skies, Ozawa's carriers themselves came under a silent, subsurface threat they never detected, the American submarine USS Albacore, having penetrated the Japanese screen, lined up a shot on the largest target in the fleet, the magnificent new flagship Tahoe. At 9:08, it fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 1 struck home. The hit was not immediately catastrophic, a single torpedo amidships, but it ruptured an aviation fuel storage tank. Fumes from the high octane gas began to seep, invisible and deadly, throughout the cavernous hangar deck. The damage control parties, following standard procedure, opened the ship's ventilation ducts to clear the fumes. Instead, they filled the entire ship with a highly explosive vapor. Tahoe was sailing with a bomb in its belly. As the shattered remnants of his second and third raids stumbled back or vanished from the radio waves, Ozawa faced a command crisis of incomprehensible scale. His returning pilots, those who made it, spoke of skies thick with hellcats, of attacks coming from nowhere, of overwhelming firepower. The scale of the losses defied belief, yet he still held to a thread of hope. He believed many of his aircraft had successfully landed on Guam as per the plan and would be regrouping for that crucial second strike. He ordered a fourth, smaller raid of 82 aircraft in the early afternoon, hoping to coordinate with these presumed land-based forces. It was a hope built on a phantom. The aircraft that had tried to reach Guam found not sanctuary but another killing zone. Alerted by radar, Admiral Mitcher had dispatched fighter sweeps to orbit over the islands, as damaged and fuel-starved Japanese planes descended towards the cratered runways of Orote Field on Guam. They were pounced upon by fresh squadrons of Hellcats. It was not a recovery, it was an ambush. Dozens of Japanese aircraft were shot down in the landing pattern or destroyed on the ground. The secure anchorage had become a trap. The shuttle system was now a one-way trip to the ocean floor. Meanwhile, the poison within the Tahoe reached its climax at approximately 14:30. Nearly 5.5 hours after the torpedo hit, a random spark, perhaps from an electric switch, a tool drop, or a generator, ignited the volatile fuel air mixture that had permeated the ship. The result was not an explosion, but a cataclysmic detonation. Massive internal shockwave ripped through the carrier's vitals. The flight deck, a 27,000-ton slab of steel, heaved upward like a leaf in a gust, then collapsed inwards. Fires of unimaginable intensity erupted from the ruptured hull. Tahoe, the pride of the Japanese Navy and the fleet's command center, was mortally wounded. Admiral Ozawa was forced to transfer his flag to the destroyer Wakatsuki and then to the carrier Zuikaku as his flagship began a slow, tortured death spiral. The disaster was not isolated. Another American submarine, the USS St, had been shadowing Ozawa's force. It fixated on the veteran carrier Shikaku, a survivor of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. At 11:22, the St fired a spread of torpedoes. 3 hit. Like the Tahoe, Shikaku's doom was sealed by aviation fuel. Fires raged out of control. Feeding on fueled and armed aircraft in the hangar, the crew fought a hopeless battle against the inferno. At 15:01, a tremendous explosion tore the ship apart. It sank quickly, taking over 1,200 men with it. In the span of a few hours, Ozawa had lost his flagship and one of his most experienced carriers, not to enemy air power but to the unseen predatory weapons his fleet had failed to detect. By nightfall on June 19, the Philippine Sea was a graveyard of Japanese aviation. The official tally would be staggering: over 340 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day of combat. American pilots, exhausted and running low on ammunition, had claimed a Ratio of kills to losses exceeding 10-1. The term, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was already cementing itself into history for the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm. It was not a defeat, it was an extinction event. The carefully husbanded squadrons, the last collective repository of Japanese naval air power, were gone. The modern kamikaze had not blown, it had been snuffed out in the upper atmosphere by a storm of steel and directed lightning. Ozawa, now on the Zuikaku, ordered a general withdrawal to the northwest. He still had carriers, but they were largely empty decks. His surviving aircraft could be counted. The dozens, the decisive battle had been fought, and it had been decisively lost. Yet, even in retreat, a final, agonizing act of the battle remained, one that would demonstrate the ruthless operational mindset of the American command and the utter desperation now facing Japan. June 20, 1944, dawned with the U.S. Fifth Fleet intact, victorious, and frustrated. Admiral Spruance knew he had won a monumental defensive victory, but the crippled Japanese fleet was escaping. For Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carrier task force, this was unacceptable. His aviators reported the enemy's retreat vector. All-day search planes combed the western horizon. Finally, at 1540, a patrol from the USS Enterprise located Ozawa's force, now over 300 miles away, at the absolute extreme limit of American aircraft range. It was a terrible dilemma: launch a strike and risk losing planes and pilots to fuel exhaustion in the dark, or let the wounded enemy slip away to fight another day. Mitcher, a flyer's admiral, made the bold decision. At 1621, he turned his carriers into the wind and launched every available strike aircraft, 216 bombers and torpedo planes. Escorted by 85 fighters, it was a desperate gamble. The pilots knew the math: a 300-mile outbound flight, a brief combat window, and a 300-mile return in pitch darkness, with fuel gauges hovering near empty. The strike, arriving near sunset, achieved tactical success but fell short of annihilation. They sank the carrier Hio, damaged several other vessels including the Zuikaku and Chiyoda, and sank 2 oilers, but the cost of the decision was paid on the return flight. Night fell. Pilots, exhausted and disoriented, struggled to find their floating homes in the black void. Mitcher, in one of the most famous and humane commands of the war, made an unprecedented decision. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on their lights, navigation lights, deck lights, even searchlights, pointed vertically into the sky. It was a glaring violation of wartime protocol, a beacon that could have drawn enemy submarines, but it was a lifeline. Pilots, their fuel exhausted, ditched their planes alongside destroyers or landed on any deck they could find. The rescue effort was chaotic and heroic. Of the 209 aircrew who participated in the strike, 130 were recovered from the water that night. The physical toll was 80 aircraft lost operationally, but the human cost was mitigated by Mitcher's audacious compassion. When the final accounting was complete, the balance sheet of the Battle of the Philippine Sea was catastrophic for Japan. They had lost 3 fleet carriers, Teiho, Shikaku, Hio, and over 600 aircraft, the vast majority of their operational carrier air power. Nearly 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead. The loss was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative. The institutional knowledge, the cadre of seasoned squadron leaders and skilled mechanics, was gone. The Japanese carrier force ceased to exist as an effective strategic instrument. For the United States, victory came with remarkably little material damage. No American ships were sunk. Casualties were limited to 123 aircrew killed and around 100 aircraft lost, many to operational accidents during the night recovery. The defensive system, the Hellcats, the radar, the CIC, the anti-aircraft gunnery, had performed almost flawlessly. The battle proved the absolute dominance of the fast carrier task force and validated Spruance's cautious defensive strategy. Saipan was secure. The invasion could proceed without naval threat. But beyond the immediate losses and preserved assets, a deeper, more profound consequence took shape: the myth of the divine wind, the belief that spirit and a miraculous convergence could save Japan, had been tested against the machinery of modern war. The miracle did not come. The wind had blown, but it was a wind of American propellers and .50 caliber bullets. The result was not salvation, but obliteration. The fall of Saipan, completed by July 9, 1944, sent seismic shocks through the Japanese empire and its political structure. American B-29 superfortresses were now within unrefueled range of Tokyo. The myth of the impregnable inner defense sphere was shattered. The disaster at sea, coupled with the loss of the island, led directly to the collapse of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government on July 18. The military and political elite could no longer hide the truth. The war was irretrievably lost. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Philippine Sea was a terminal diagnosis. The carrier force, the offensive weapon that had begun the war at Pearl Harbor, was now a hollow shell. The remaining carriers would be largely relegated to decoy roles, as would be seen at Leyte Gulf. The concept of the Kamikaze, the decisive fleet battle that would reverse the war, had been tried and had resulted in decisive defeat. There would be no more grand clashes of carriers. Naval strategy now devolved to a desperate piecemeal defense of the island chains leading to Japan. Most consequentially, the utter failure of conventional tactics, of skill, of planning, of spirit to effect any change against American material supremacy forced a horrifying doctrinal evolution. If trained pilots in advanced aircraft could not penetrate American defenses, perhaps untrained pilots in cruder machines, guided only by fatalistic resolve, could. The psychological and strategic vacuum left by the turkey shoot was filled by a new, more literal interpretation of the ancient myth. If a divine wind would not arise naturally, it would have to be consciously manufactured. It would be human-guided. The first official Kamikaze Special Attack Unit was formed in October 1944, just 4 months after the Marianas disaster, specifically in response to the American landings at Leyte Gulf. The pilots, many with just enough training to take off and fly straight, were now the vessels of the divine wind. Their aircraft were the Typhoon. This was not Admiral Ozawa's tactical shuttle. It was a one-way trip to oblivion, a surrender of strategy entirely to the realm of symbolic sacrifice. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had proven that faith in a miracle was insufficient against radar-directed Hellcats. The Japanese military's terrible conclusion was that the miracle now required the absolute physical sacrifice of the believer. The modern kamikaze was born not from strength, but from the ashes of total conventional defeat. On the American side, the victory cemented doctrinal and technological paths. The fast carrier task force was confirmed as the primary instrument of Pacific power projection. The integration of radar, CIC, and fighter direction became standard, evolving further. With the introduction of the Combat Air Patrol Coordinator, or Tomcat, the F-6F Hellcat was enshrined as the war-winning naval fighter. Tactically, the battle reinforced the overwhelming preference for defensive counter-air operations, letting the enemy impale himself on prepared defenses. Strategically, it unlocked the Central Pacific. With the Japanese fleet broken, the path to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the Japanese homeland itself was clear. The United States had not only won a battle, it had gained unchallenged control of the operational environment. The sea and the sky belonged to them. In the end, the Battle of the Philippine Sea stands as one of history's most one-sided major engagements. It was the moment the war in the Pacific ceased to be a contest and became an inexorable progression. The Japanese soldier and sailor would continue to fight with incredible tenacity, but after June 1920, 1944, they were no longer fighting to win a war. They were fighting to determine the manner and the price of their nation's defeat. The divine wind had been measured, quantified, and finally disproven by the relentless logic of industrial warfare. The Philippine Sea, vast and deep, holds the silence of that June battle within its depths. The Zero fighters and their pilots rest where they fell, scattered across the ocean floor. Like forgotten seeds of a different time, theirs was a faith in the intangible, in spirit, in heritage, in a celestial favor written into national destiny. Across the water, the American carriers, those steel cities, embodied a faith in the tangible, in ore smelted, in circuits soldered, in systems engineered, and procedures followed. The battle was not merely a victory of one navy over another, it was the conclusive demonstration of a new age. Warfare had transcended the realm of individual courage and commander's art and entered the age of the system, the anonymous fighter. Director in the CIC, interpreting blips on a screen, held more decisive power that day than any samurai admiral. The battle proved that in the mid-20th century, the miracle was no longer supernatural. The miracle was production. The miracle was logistics. The miracle was a coordinated network of radar, radio, and metal. And yet the human spirit, denied its place as a decisive weapon, found a darker, more tragic outlet. The literal kamikaze that arose in the battle's wake was a grotesque perversion of the ancient myth, no longer a wind that saved a nation, but a wind of self-annihilation, hoping to make the victor's cost unbearable. It was the final, desperate recourse of a culture whose foundational martial belief had been rendered obsolete by a more crushing form of power. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot stands as a watershed. It marks the point where the aircraft carrier ascended to the throne of naval supremacy, a throne it holds to this day. More somberly, it marks the point where an ancient faith in divine intervention broke against the hard reality of industrial and technological might, the winds that change. History, the battle tells us, are not summoned from the heavens, they are built in shipyards, designed in laboratories, and flown by pilots guided by the cool, unblinking eye of a radar screen. In the end, the only divine wind that blew over the Philippine Sea was the one manufactured in the factories of a nation that believed not in destiny, but in the possible.